Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'm going to talk about the subject of when a contradiction is true. And to be very clear, I don't mean a contradiction in the sense of a logical contradiction. That is to say, like in the form of logic, P and not P. A thing can never be true and false in the same way, in the same respect, at the same time, and so forth. I don't mean that. What I'm referring to, though, is you'll find all sorts of things, specifically trying to communicate wisdom, that will come in the form of a contradiction, or what looks to be a contradiction. And I'm going to take one as an example and talk about it. But the basic thing about these, where you can tell that something is trying to convey wisdom as opposed to is just simple nonsense, is that the thing is clearly not in the same way. Is not talking about the thing in precisely the same way. It'll use similar terminology, but, and this is sort of where it's crucial, it will be talking about a thing where there are two sorts of mistakes you can make, generally two sorts of opposite mistakes you can make. And it will frequently be warning you about these opposite mistakes that you can make by seeming to have a contradiction in how it's put. And this often makes it memorable. This makes it much simpler to describe. So the example I'm going to use comes from the book of Proverbs. In chapter 26, you have, right immediately following each other, first, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. And then immediately following it, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. This is the Revised Standard Version, by the way. The term, or the phrase, according to his folly, you'll see other translations that will put it like, in terms of his folly. Do not answer a fool in terms of his folly. So, very briefly, that in terms of his folly, or according to his folly, one of the things that fools will do is they will tend to say things or ask questions that not only are either the thing's wrong or the question is not a sensible question to ask, but it's not a simple thing. Like a foolish question is what color is a loud noise? They're not, synesthesia aside, they don't have colors. Color's not a property of a sound. That's a malformed question. But that's a very obviously malformed question. It's malformed on the surface. The way that fools will tend to ask questions will be questions that seem superficially to make sense, but underneath rest on premises which are mistaken. That the question, take a question, how can you eat your cake and have it too? That is to say, how can you go about both eating the cake and still having having that same cake to eat later on? Well, you can't. But this has sort of at a lower level, and it's still a fairly obvious one, but it has a little bit lower level the idea that you can actually accomplish such a task. It's only the means to it that you are unclear of. And here, there's the example that I was using is much deeper, much richer, of do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself, and answer a fool according to his folly, lest he think himself wise. So, the problem that you have when a fool will say something that requires an answer is that you can't really give a simple answer, because a simple answer is going to be in the terms of the thing that was originally said. Examples come to mind. I'll give an example in a moment, though. The problem is that you can't really do that because those terms encode a fundamental mistake, and to answer in those terms is to grant that fundamental mistake, and therefore the answer is not going to make sense. Take another example. The time when Jesus was asked about I can't remember if it was 5 or 7, probably 7, brothers, who had a wife, and each in their turn died, and then the next one married her, and so all 7 married her and then died, none producing any children. And then the Sadducees, who pose this question and don't believe in the afterlife, said, now in the afterlife, whose wife will she be? And what Jesus replied was, you haven't understood this. That in the afterlife, people are like, do not marry or are given in marriage, they're like the angels. So you can see what he's doing is he is directly saying that you can't, this question does not admit of an answer because the question is built on mistaken premises. And so this is that first one, not answering a fool according to his folly. Not answering the fool in the same terms of his folly. You can't just give an answer here because the question itself encodes something that is mistaken, and you have to point out that fundamental mistake encoded in the question itself. There's a problem with this, though, and this is where we come to that second proverb, and that is, when you do this, the fool will always accuse you of having dodged the question, of not really answering the question. You're trying to get away from it. You see this in online debates all the time, where you're just trying to evade this. It's like, no, you asked a stupid question. Your question is just wrong because it encodes premises that are false. I cannot give you an answer according to it because it's wrong. There is no answer to give because it's not a reasonable question. And the fool will triumph saying, aha, I have won, you cannot answer me. Like the classic, can God create a rock so big he can't lift it? It's the answer is but if the answer is no, then that means that God is not omnipotent because he can't do everything. And as C.S. Lewis pointed out at length, basically just Google this, that the fundamental problem is the question is nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. There is not such a thing conceivable. There's no such thing as a rock so big God can't lift it. So you're asking, can God make a thing which is not a thing? Which is a contradiction in terms. You have not, in fact, asked a question. You've just babbled some nonsense. And as C.S. Lewis famously said, nonsense doesn't suddenly become sense merely because you preface it with the words, God can. So the problem is this question is not actually a question. It's just a bunch of noises that happen to resemble words because you can't resolve it to a meaning. When you try to say a rock so big that God can't lift it, those words in that order don't refer to anything. There's no referent. They're just words. In the same way that if you were to say rabbit, rabbit, buffalo, rabbit, those are words, but they don't mean anything in that order. You haven't put together an actual coherent meaning such that these symbols of the words refer to something. Same problem. But, and here is this difficulty that people always come across. Whenever you do that, whenever you point out the question as such just doesn't make any sense, what you get invariably whenever you're pointing this out to a fool is the fool will say, you're just dodging. This is just word salad to avoid my question. I win. They do it reliably. Just try it sometimes. You'll see they do it all of the time. It's just really, really common. And this is the problem with only looking at that first half of not answering a fool according to his folly. The problem is that the fool will then do that. The fool will think himself wise. And so you do have to give, at the same time, to avoid that thing, if that's worth avoiding in the particular circumstance. Not every question has this issue, and not even every time you deal with a fool has this issue. Sometimes it is sufficient to let the fool triumph looking like a fool. You don't always have to prove it. But if you're trying to help the fool, you then have to go in the other direction and give him an answer in words that he will actually understand. And when you say, the rock, can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it? And then the answer to that, that one, I haven't picked exactly the perfect example here for going in the other direction. But the problem here, basically, is that there's you will never find a simple way to answer. An example comes to mind, which sort of is like this. The people who don't understand eternity and ask, what was God doing before he created the universe? And there's that glib answer. The real answer, of course, being there's no such thing as time before the universe was created, because God is outside of time. There's no such thing. Because time only began with the creation of the time being a creature, only began with the creation of the universe. There is no such thing as before time, because time is not itself situated in another time. It's in eternity, and eternity isn't time with a before. There's a eternal present. So that's the real answer. St. Augustine, though, mentioned there is, of course, that answer. What was God doing before the creation of the world? Preparing a hell for people who would ask such stupid questions. And I think the way to put it is it's tempting to give that answer. And the thing is, there's a reason that answer is tempting. It's not a full answer. It's not usually the answer that you should, well, maybe you should lead off. I was going to say you shouldn't lead off with it. Maybe you should lead off with it. What you shouldn't do is leave that as your only answer. But the reason why it can be good to include such an answer there is because that is answering a fool according to his folly. To say, what was God doing before the creation of the world? He was preparing a hell for people who would ask such stupid questions, is to answer the fool according to his folly. He won't necessarily, he probably won't, I mean, if he really is the full-on fool, he won't understand when you explain that there's no such thing as the time before time began. That's a contradiction. That's not a thing. That's not what's being referred to. You've just missed out on there's other stuff in the world, namely eternity. Or I'm sorry, there's other stuff, namely eternity. And eternity doesn't admit of before and after. It doesn't have that sort of sequential relationship. He's going to miss that. So you're answering in terms he will at least not miss. And the purpose of insulting him in this fashion, because he is a fool, is that if he will not take the former answer, or possibly he might give this and then go on to the more elaborate answer, if he won't take the real answer, the fact that you are giving him this answer he will understand, it's an insult, but it's got a purpose because this was in fact a bad question, and by insulting him you are letting him know that you reject the question. And at least he has grasped that much, that he will know that he has not won because you are simply insulting him, you are rejecting him in a way that he understands. So, to apply that to, can God create a rock so big that God can't lift it? And the answer would be, obviously not. God can lift anything in the sense that God can cause any sort of motion. It's not like God has a body. So, to answer the fool according to his folly in this question, it'd be nice. I don't have off the top of my head a sort of, a nice witty reply that uses the exact same words, but you can, to some degree, even just laughing at the thing is answering the fool according to his folly, at least to some degree. And, a little bit more broadly, you can say, you can answer it the fool according to his folly just by saying, that's a really stupid question. Or alternatively by pointing out that, this is really quite a children's question. Now, don't leave it there. As I said, and why there are those two proverbs right next to each other, don't just leave it at calling the thing stupid. Don't just leave it at an insult. Do actually give the real explanation, tempered, of course, to whether or not, however much of it it's possible for the person to understand. Frequently more of it if there's someone who's looking on who might possibly actually understand the explanation, so you give it to the person who's talking to you for the sake of the other person, not for the sake of the fool you're actually talking to. But at the same time, you don't want to just give the fuller answer that maybe somebody else will understand, and the fool will think you're just running away scared from him. And so this is why you want to do the other one of, can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it? To reply that, you're actually asking me this child's question? You, apparently grown person, are asking this sort of childish question? Really? Okay. And then giving a real answer. That does both. And the thing about it is that it doesn't let the fool just sit there thinking, aha, I have won. Now, it doesn't matter to you whether or not the fool thinks that he's won. That doesn't hurt you in any way. But it does matter to the fool. Now, he's not going to, just suddenly turn his life around merely because you don't let him think that he's won by pointing out that he's just being a fool in one form or another that he will not miss. And that's intrinsically an insult, by the way. I know, in general, people like the idea of tea time rules, never offending anybody. But if a person is asked a foolish question, you can kind of, dance around the fact, your answer really doesn't actually make any sense. There's no intelligent meaning behind it. And like maybe he won't notice that the words you're saying are a little bit harsh. But if you do it successfully enough, if you do your dance successfully enough that he doesn't notice, you will have failed to answer him. If he notices what you mean, that the question that he has asked is one that does not correspond to reality in any way, that it has no value because it is just a bunch of words that do not have a meaning, well, that's bad. He just did the sort of thing a human being should not do. He did the sort of thing that's like, throwing the silverware on the floor. He just produced noise. He didn't produce rational communication. And, yeah, like if you actually understand that to be the case, that's bad. It implies something bad about him. It is an insult to convey that. But the problem is it's true. So your two options are either to convey this insulting truth successfully, such that he gets it and is insulted, or to not convey this insulting truth, in which case he will not feel insulted because you didn't actually communicate effectively. There are no other options. If the meaning of what you have to convey is intrinsically insulting, you can either succeed or fail, but you can't possibly succeed in a way where he won't feel insulted. You might possibly... There is a distinction, and a legitimate distinction, between making him feel insulted and loved, and insulted and despised, but that's about the best you can do. The best you can do is to say, is to communicate roughly. I'm not here presenting the rhetoric of it, but just the meaning that the rhetoric would have of, you're a fool, but if you want to get better, I'd be happy to help you. And you're a fool and you are nothing to me. I reject you as inhuman. Go away from me. Those are roughly the two meanings. Those are the two endpoints of the spectrum of meaning that you can convey. If, again, on the assumption that what you're dealing with is the sort of fool who would give you nonsense as a question. Now, he may not realize it's nonsense, but that's sort of better for his... It's better for his goodwill if he doesn't realize that it's nonsense, but it's worse for his intellect if he doesn't realize that it's nonsense. And unless the guy is really has very, very little in the way of intelligence, the person asking a foolish question, the best you can say is that he has been so lazy he has never thought this through to come up with, or to confront the fact that what he's asking has no actual meaning. And so, there's no good way out of it. There are ways that aren't quite as bad, but they're all bad. And so you have to convey that the person just did something bad culpably and is guilty of having done something bad. That's where you are. That's what answering a fool according to his folly will look like. And it is not nice. It is not pleasant. And if you love the person, that is to say, if you desire his good for his sake, not for yours, then instead of just keeping things pleasant and keeping things nice and failing to communicate the truth of the thing, you may need to answer him according to his folly. You may need to point out to him that he was just an idiot. An idiot that you would like to help, but an idiot. And if you don't let him know that he was just an idiot, he will go along thinking himself wise because he will not have understood your actually more complicated answer. And what's worse, he is therefore less likely to ever understand it. Because, of course, remember, when you give somebody something that they don't understand immediately, that is not at all the same thing as them never understanding it. And I think everybody who's an adult has had this experience of suddenly realizing what somebody meant, like possibly months, years later. You just suddenly, you learn something and suddenly hits you. That's what he meant. And you might be going back 5 years to something you hadn't really even thought about in between, but suddenly you've got the connections and and you didn't really understand it at the time, but now finally you get it. People who are parents have that experience somewhat frequently, where their parents will say things that were cryptic to them at the time, and now that they themselves have had children, the relationships they have the sufficient experience to understand what the heck was meant by this very cryptic thing. But everyone has this. And so this is, by the way, a big part of why you should also answer a fool according to his folly. Because if you challenge him this way, he's not going to, in the moment, go like, oh, really? I was just an idiot? Well, let me fix my life, and I'll try to do better. He's not going to do that right there. But what he might do is if he understands that he didn't win, he might continue trying to grapple with you over time in his mind when he goes off. Might even possibly, although this is not super likely, do a bit of research. But at least subconsciously, he may be trying to figure out what his comeback should have been, how to crush that nonsense that you said, where clearly you're not running away because you were willing to confront him. You're willing to say, you're an idiot. But, you're an idiot, and here's the actual answer to the thing, if you want to stop being an idiot, which is a loving action. He may choose not to, wrestle with this, and then wrestle with the more meaty thing, the stuff, that the real answer. And eventually, over time, he may, in that wrestling, come to figure out that he had been a fool and begin to turn his life around, or at least sort of have a much clearer and better option for turning his life around there. And so that, working through the concrete thing, is why you might want to answer a fool according to his folly, lest he think himself wise. And also why, at the same time, you want to not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you be a fool too. Because if you do nothing but tell a fool you're an idiot, it's really easy to slip down into just fighting people, into just being angry, into making the thing about yourself, into wanting to feel like you've won. And the point is not to win. Not at all. The point is to help the fool. Because after all, the whole, one of the reasons you are given strength is to lift up the weak. And if you have been given understanding, then one of the reasons for you to have been given understanding is to help the fool, which is essentially just lifting up the weak. It's not about you winning, it's about you helping him. And that's why you want to do both of these things that are kind of contradictory to each other. So, this, I think, is a fairly good example of where contradictions teach you a lot that you couldn't teach by just the one or the other, that there are sort of, roughly speaking, opposite mistakes that you can make. And if you avoid the one too much, you'll make the other. And so this sort of contradiction, which is not actually contradictory, because you can, of course, give a fool more than one answer. So, it's phrased negatively, which kind of, attracts the attention. But when you think about it, to some degree, it means do not only give a fool, or do not answer a fool only according to his folly, and nor does it mean answer a fool only according to his folly. But it doesn't work as well. If you actually put those things in, it doesn't have the same sort of hook. It's not as pithy and small, and unfortunately, being sort of frail and of limited intellect as we are, those sorts of hooks, like the apparent contradictions and the ability to make the sayings very pithy, help us to hold on to them, help us to remember these things, help us to, give some place for us to hold on to and think about. So if you were to say them out in full precision, they tend to do people less good. So that's why you will see, in any great wisdom tradition, you will tend to see contradictions come up, because these apparent contradictions are frequently the best way to catch people's attention about a problem where there are two opposite ways to fail, and how you have to be very careful because any sort of extreme will result in a kind of failure. And so you need to warn them at the same time to be wary of two opposite ways of failing, and this apparent contradiction does that, and does it effectively. Of course, the apparent contradiction actually containing wisdom does sort of create a shadow in which actual foolishness can hide, where things are actual contradictions and just sound vaguely like they're supposed to be that kind of apparent but not real contradiction. And there's no universal rule for how you tell these things apart. You have to actually learn from them to the degree that you can. And if you can learn something true, it was an apparent contradiction that isn't real. And if you can't actually learn anything true, then it was a real contradiction that was pretending to be something better than it was. And for some reason, everyone these days just wants hard and fast rules. But unfortunately, a lot of the time, it is not the shape, but the content that determines whether a thing is wise or foolish, true or false, good or evil. And there's no real way around that. You have to actually know things. You can't just have a quick little way of, telling what something is without actually finding out in specific what it is. And yeah, in other words, there's no substitute for wisdom. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at,